Thank you for joining us for this actually first meeting of the New York Public Service Commission and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I'd say that as Commissioner Moeller just said, this is Commissioners on Broadway. So we're all excited to be here. First of all, I want to thank Chairwoman LaFleur for her suggestion, actually, initially, that we have this meeting, and thought it was a wonderful idea, and appreciative of both the FERC commissioners as well as the PSC commissioners for agreeing to get together, because we think this is such an important matter as we move forward. From the perspective of New York, and as something that I always like to keep in mind, is that every year New Yorkers pay about $21 billion in electricity. And for many of our customers, this electricity is their first or second largest expense. And last winter, we at the State Commission, and I know the FERC, all had a wake-up call, but particularly at the State Commission, where we saw so many customers who had trouble paying their bills after the polar vortex. And we had more issues of arrearages, and thanks to the work of both our consumer service staff and our utilities, we've been able to maintain the amount of shutoffs, but it was a struggle, and I think, I probably speak for everyone at this table, we would like not to see a repeat of last winter in terms of its effect on consumers, because it is hard. So, you know, when I think about today and what we're trying to do, is it's always in the context of the Public Service Commission's role, and our focus on making sure electricity is affordable, it's reliable, and clean. And as a bias, for us, we believe at the Commission that one of the best ways we could move forward in that direction is always to take a look at the availability of markets where there are markets, and how to manage and get to the innovation that is there for the benefit of consumers. So in that vein, as many of you know, last year, the Commission, the State Commission, undertook a very broad initiative to really re-examine our markets and also our regulation with the eye towards recognizing as the technology has changed, as innovation has changed, as customer demands are changing, we need to make sure that we don't see of anything as sacrosanct, and really take a hard look at what we're doing well, what we need to improve, and to make sure both the industry and the regulatory climate moving forward is meeting the needs of consumers and taking advantage of where we can go to achieve the goals we want in the 21st century. So it really is a looking forward approach. But one of the things that I'm always aware of course, is that however well we can design the retail markets, we're only going to be as good as to make sure that there's alignment in the wholesale markets, and that in this curious regulatory arrangement we have in the United States, we are essentially joined at the hip with FERC in thinking about what we need to do in wholesale policy in terms of price setting and making sure reliability and the supply side, and how that aligns with what we're trying to do on the retail side, and make sure that, as both agencies are very much concerned about the outcome, is to see and to always be aware of how we can examine things and get things better. So, you know, for me, part of the test of markets is really the confidence that we can build first in consumers, also in investors and other market participants. So I think part of what we're looking at today is trying to really start this conversation, thinking about where we can go with the markets, and really hearing from all the stakeholders, as we would want to continue to do, as well as the market operators and the market monitors, what do we need to improve? And it's not necessarily a condemnation of the past, but it's a recognition that technology is changing, there's innovation occurring, and what we need to think about is not what we did wrong, but what do we need to continue to do to make things right. And one of the thoughts I had as I was coming over here, this is a part, I think, of age, is since I was around when the markets started, it was we're really starting we're kind of in the second decade of the RTO markets. And it's kind of a little bit like your 15-year-old. You know, there's like the good 15-year-old and the bad 15-year-old. But the good 15-year-old is probably doing like 70% of the things okay, But you kind of want to make some adjustments as they're getting into adulthood to make sure that things are continue to move in the right direction. And I sort of am taking this from the standpoint, I think the markets are working pretty well, but it's always a good time to sit back and say, well, what can we do better as we move forward to make sure that they continue to do well and we continue to maintain and grow the confidence of the people who are reliant on the markets. So I am looking forward to the conversation today as we start this dialogue. One of the things that Brandeis has always said that laboratories, or the states are the laboratories of democracy. I think one of the great advantages that we have as a single state ISO is that we can be a great laboratory of change. We can be nimble, we can work together, we can work in partnership with the stakeholders that are interested in both sides of the market, as well as with the FERC. And I think that this to me, and I'm very much appreciative of Chairwoman LaFleur and the other commissioners, of saying let's get together, let's start looking at these things, and let's start figuring out how we together can make it better. So thank you. And what I'm going to do now is I'll turn the gavel over to Chairwoman LaFleur, and we will go from there. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair Zibelman. I really am honored to be here with all my colleagues from New York and my colleagues from Washington. And we know that the issues we're working on are important. That's demonstrated by the sold-out attendance at the conference, as well as the protesters out on the street outside. These issues matter to a lot of people. I really appreciate the efforts that the staff from both FERC and the PSC have made to stage this event in a place that's home to neither of us, and I think they've done a great job pulling it together. I want to offer a few thoughts about why I did suggest the conference and lay out my objectives for the day. Really have two goals in thinking about it. I do agree with Audrey. I think that competitive markets and capacity markets in particular are at a critical point in their evolution, and I think it's a very timely opportunity to look at them and to make sure that they're properly functioning for the challenges we see now in terms of attracting capital. And I know that some of FERC's decisions here in New York, not far from here, have been very controversial, so it seems like a timely time, if that's not a redundant, to talk about how the market is doing. Secondly, I know from conversations with Audrey around the time of the polar vortex when we were together in that tech conference that New York is working on some innovative approaches to look at regulation at the distribution level and distributed resources, and I think it's important to think about how those will interact with the wholesale markets, and that's on this afternoon's agenda. We are seeing across the country a dramatic change in the nation's resource mix, and that's certainly true here in New York with more reliance on natural gas and renewables, and that's really stressing the competitive markets. The competitive markets were designed back when they were not teenagers to shift investment risks from customers to investors, dispatch resources more efficiently over a broader footprint, pass along savings to customers more quickly, and they have done all of those things and done them quite well. Customers have benefited from early recognition of lower fuel costs and more efficient dispatch and planning. Now that we're seeing so much in the way of power supply changes and fleet turnover, it's pushing markets into a major investment cycle. And it's much easier to like markets when prices are going down than when prices are going up. But not just here in New York and around the country, the need for investment that the markets are calling on is making prices rise. We saw this when we approved the request to create the Lower Hudson Valley Capacity Zone earlier this year. Understandably created a lot of controversy due to concern over high prices, but we believed it was not only required under the existing rules, but necessary to protect future reliability, and I believe it's already working to do so. But those decisions aren't easy, and we'll have to continue to make them, I think, around the country. Some of the things we're really working on right now with respect to markets that I saw teed up in some of the presentations. The first is, are the markets properly defining the products they seek, especially the capacity product definition, to protect reliability? With so much more reliance on natural gas, looking at whether the markets price the fuel assurance to produce either the pipeline infrastructure that's needed or other fuel infrastructure to keep the lights on. And that's something I'm interested in hearing about from our guests from the New York ISO. Also have done a lot of work to make sure different new resources compete fairly in the markets. That dovetails with the work that our New York colleagues are looking at the state level, and it's an important effort to see how those fit together. Just want to do one little lawyerly thing before we start. We did put out a list of dockets that may come up during the course of the day, particularly some of the New York capacity market dockets, not surprisingly. The purpose of the conference is not to discuss specific cases, but we knew those might come up in passing. Unfortunately, there's one thing we can't discuss that we would like to, which is Order 745, the Commission's order on compensation of demand response in competitive markets, and especially the energy market, and which has been vacated by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And because there's a complaint pending on that, under our ex parte rules, we can't discuss it either affirmatively or in listening, so we'll have to reserve that for some future conversation. And with that little warning, I'll turn it back to our colleagues.
Thank you. So before we begin with the panelists, let me just open it to any other commissioners might want to say anything.
First of all, I just want to thank for doing this with us today. I think this is incredibly valuable. Secondly, is this a 15-year-old boy or a 15-year-old girl? I've had both, and they're very different.
They're both difficult. But, you know, we all have, like, the good kid and the bad kid.
Yeah, exactly.
Commissioner Berman.
I think my mother said I was the bad kid, so I'm a little concerned. I just wanted to give a minute or two my perspective and what I'm looking for out of this conference. First, I thank both of the chairs for doing this. I think this is excellent, and including us, all the commissioners, is really very helpful. To me, this conference is about our two commissions coming together and actively listening to whether and how capacity markets need to evolve to reflect changes in the industry. The primary overarching issue for me is system reliability. That is an essential and critical feature of the electric market. Frankly, I think that core issue is really one I believe we all embrace and permeates throughout all of our respective regulatory responsibilities. The initial narrow purpose of the capacity markets was to resolve the missing money issue. How much capacity should and is procured is determined by what's needed for reliability, and that is a perfect place for where the market should come into play. But with this, there is going to be a natural friction or blurred lines or just differences of opinions over our respective jurisdictional roles and how we work together to get to a successful resolution. But I believe we can work together. I do believe if designed properly, capacity markets do send a powerful signal to private investors that if they can build dependable generation, revenues will be there to recoup part of their outlay, regardless of the vagaries of the energy markets, or even at times what might feel to some like interference from the public sector. Given that, it's clear we need to hear from stakeholders today on how the markets might be improved to support those resources that are most dependable and that could be better coordinated with the energy and ancillary services market. My inclination is that I believe well-designed capacity markets are, in the long run, the best approach for customers in New York as a whole. I think that any changes discussed or contemplated today need to be implemented with extreme care so as not to create either windfalls or busts unnecessarily for market participants, or to cause so much uncertainty that we actually unintentionally discourage investment even in the short term. So in conclusion, I'm really very glad to be here today, to listen today on how to find pathways that help guide all of us on what is the proper evolution of the markets and how folks think we should respond to them. Thank you.
Good morning. It's always nice to be part of a first ever, and this is very exciting. And we know we're in exciting times. But the one thing I've learned since I've been on the commission is that nothing is ever perfect and something can always be improved. And I think it is our obligation as commissioners, both federal and at state level, to really sit here, listen, to do more listening possibly than speaking, and before we ever make decisions, to fully understand all the interests. I mean, we're going to talk about a lot of things here today, and I think that it's something that it's important that we have this dialogue, but I don't think anybody should walk away today with any preconceived notion that we have made any determinations. This is all up for discussion, and so communication is probably the most important aspect of what we do as commissioners. So looking forward to getting this going.
I'm delighted to have this joint session. I think everybody up here at this whole table shares the goals of power that is affordable, reliable, and clean, and markets that are customer-focused, competitively driven, and fair to all participants. And somehow we have to ensure that the intricately designed wholesale market dovetails neatly with the retail market that we are looking at changing so dramatically. It's a tall order, and it's wonderful to have us all together here.
Well, I too send thanks to the New York Commission for hosting us and for all involved in setting this up. The first of its kind on Broadway. It's great to be here. I think back on the 8 years I've spent on this commission, and I've frankly spent a disproportionate amount of time on New York issues and a disproportionate amount of time in New York.
But all fun, right?
Oh, I'll get to that. There have been a lot of difficult decisions, and in the attempt to make sure that the markets work as best as they can, trying to make sure that there's adequate resources here, a more robust transmission system. And some of those decisions were tough and sometimes controversial, but I was always motivated by what's best for New York and the consumers up here. And so I'm looking forward to a good, thorough discussion today. I also want to commend the New York Commission and Audrey for your leadership in kind of re-examining issues. And I'm not going to say I'm going to endorse everything in your plan, but the fact that that you are willing to take another look, particularly as it pertains to price formation, price responsiveness, and sending accurate price signals to consumers, because I trust the consumers. I think if we give them the right information, they can make good decisions that will be in their benefit and the benefit of the system. And finally, dovetailing a little bit on your comment about the 15-year-old, for those folks who weren't around when the markets began or in part of these discussions, it's easy to forget how much benefit the markets have given to consumers. We kind of take it for granted now, but in the days before markets, it was a much less efficient system, and consumers didn't benefit from it. So as we move forward, I think it's important to remember that we can take the benefits of markets for granted. We shouldn't. In the meanwhile, we're trying to improve them and make it better for both the reliability and the consumer impacts of the system. So again, thank you for having us. Look forward to a good discussion today.
Thanks as well to my colleagues, both state and on the FERC, and thanks to all of you for being here. I would tee up the question, why are we here? And I don't mean like what's on the agenda. We know what's on the agenda, but sort of like Phil talking about the disproportionate amount of time spent on New York issues. I totaled up one day the total amount of load in New England and New York combined. I think it's about 7% of the U.S. load. I think it's probably about 70% of my workload. So the Commission spends a great deal of time on these issues. This type of technical conference is a very rare thing. The only thing that I can think of that's somewhat similar to it, where we sit down and talk about regulatory construct issues between the state and federal government, was probably one in California. So we've got one in California, we've got one in New York. The interesting thing is we don't hold these in a lot of other parts of the country. We don't have anything like this in the Southeast. We don't have anything like it in the Northwest or my native Midwest. I would suggest that the common factor which drives a lot of the concerns to the surface, whereby then we have a meeting like this, is in areas where we have high electricity rates. And that really brings it to the fore. Now, it doesn't surprise any of you in this room. I'm not a New Yorker. I'm from North Dakota, which has typically about the lowest electricity rates in the country. I think 6 or 8 cents was retail rates was about what they were when I left the state. So the question is then, what are the underlying causes of it? Why are retail electric rates so high? And I hope that's what we can focus in on, and I share the concern that Chair Zibelman raised earlier today here. Some folks will point to the markets generically, either capacity markets or otherwise, but I'd just make the observation that if you look at the parts of the country that restructured, like New York and New England, they had the highest electric rates before restructuring. Now we're through restructuring, still continue to be areas of the country that have very high electric rates. What I would suggest is there's some underlying factors there that are driving that, and the market prices that we're getting out are really just a symptom of some of those underlying factors. And so hopefully over the next few weeks and months as we study this, we'll be able to talk a bit about that. I would suggest, and I've talked about it on a number of occasions, it probably comes down in a lot of instances to infrastructure issues, oftentimes lack of specific infrastructure in places that need it. It can come from rapidly transitioning an energy generation fleet from traditional sources of energy, which tend to be very affordable, to something else which might be more expensive. It can come from high state and local taxes or other burdens that can be placed at the state and local level. My point is that there are a lot of underlying drivers, and I hope as we all work through this, and we should look at markets and capacity markets and ensure that they're functioning properly, that we look at the whole suite of issues that I think are really driving some of the cost concerns that all of us are hearing here in New York, but also in the greater Northeast. So it's a big chore. I'm sure we'll be studying it a lot over the next few weeks and months, but thanks to all of you and all the presenters who will be here today to help us dig into those questions.
I too wish to thank the New York Public Service Commission for hosting this conference on New York markets and infrastructure. This conference, when you look at the agenda, you can see that it covers a lot of ground and it examines important, tough questions on New York's capacity markets as well as other issues. I look forward to hearing the reports of the New York ISO and the Independent Market Monitor, and then the presentations of the 2 panels that follow their reports. 2 of the most important questions in my mind are, first, how is the New York ISO's capacity market doing? Obviously, there have been a lot of reports and there have been a number of concerns that have been expressed, but now we have the opportunity to hear from the New York ISO and from the Market Monitor. Is it achieving its goals and ensuring adequate reserve margins, and doing so in a way that provides value to consumers? A number of people here today have raised the question of whether or not there are potential tweaks to the market that should occur. A second question for me is, and this is echoing comments from other commissioners, is that are there things that FERC and the New York Public Service Commission can do to work more effectively together, to work more closely together? Obviously, a sign of FERC's commitment to that relationship is the fact that we're here today doing this joint technical conference. As federal and state regulators, we are more effective when we have good communication and collaboration while recognizing that we have different authorities and jurisdiction.
Well, thank you. The order of play here is I'm going to moderate the morning session, and Chair Zibelman is going to moderate the afternoon session. So we're going to kick off with, to set the stage for our discussions, a brief presentation from the New York ISO and the Independent Market Monitor for the New York ISO. So we're fortunate to have with us Steve Whitley, the CEO of the New York ISO, Emily Nelson, the Vice President of Market Operations at the New York ISO, and Dr. David Patton of Potomac Economics, who's the Independent Market Monitor, to tell us a little bit about how the market is functioning from their perspective and some things that might be in the pipeline, no pun intended, in terms of market changes. So we'll kick it off with Steve.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair LaFleur, Chair Zibelman, for the opportunity for the New York ISO to be here today to talk about our markets in general and specifically the capacity markets. Let me say at the beginning that I see this as an opportunity for the FERC and the New York PSC and the New York stakeholders to continue the collaboration that has started in the 1990s when the NYSO was first conceived and formed to benefit New Yorkers. I look forward to a constructive dialogue which will help the NYSO provide additional benefits to New York's electric consumers. Now, I've been personally involved in the operation of wholesale electricity markets now for 15 years and can confidently say that the NYSO's market design, which includes both capacity and energy, is working well to achieve the goals that were envisioned by the New York PSC's competitive opportunities case and by the FERC in its orders in approving ISO administrated markets. First, the New York locational energy and capacity price signals have gotten generation built and gotten it built in the right places. That's very important. We've already seen significant new entry into southeastern New York, which is the state's largest load center. My experience in New England was much different because there we initially put in markets without locational price signals, and as a result, generation actually located closest to the intersection of gas pipelines and the transmission lines, and that wasn't where the load was. And of course, as you all know, that resulted in about $6 to $10 billion worth of transmission investment to get it to the load centers. In New York, went in initially with a market with correct price signals right from the get-go, and it worked. Since the inception of the NYSO, most of the new entrants have been clean, efficient, combined cycle units, which has contributed to New York's generation fleet's improved heat rate, saving billions of dollars, and reduced harmful emissions. Contributing to this positive environmental trend is the fact that 6,000 megawatts of older generation has retired or ceased operation since the startup of the NYSO. Old, dirty, and inefficient units ultimately go away under competition. The NYSO's competitive markets have also given generators the incentive to always be available to operate, especially during peak conditions. New York's generators have much higher availability and capacity factors than they did under the previous cost of service regime. These attributes are obviously very good for reliability. For the most part, the units are now owned and operated by merchant developers, which has shifted the risk of investments away from end users who have historically borne much of the cost of stranded investments. If a power plant proves uneconomic under today's model, ratepayers are protected from having to pay for that project over and over again. In an effort to send accurate price signals, the NYSO has worked hard to get the marginal units to set energy prices, and most recently have improved shortage and scarcity pricing rules to take pressure off the amount of capacity market revenues needed. Sending accurate price signals minimizes out-of-merit dispatch and uplift costs that loads cannot hedge. Now, when I started at the NYSO in 2008, we had a major uplift challenge. Remember the Lake Erie loop flows? And the end-use consumers, particularly the large commercial and industrial customers, let me know about this at a high decibel level, and some of those folks are on your panels later this afternoon. I'm proud to say that the NYSO, working with our stakeholders, have successfully addressed that issue and now experience very low uplift in New York, and that was even demonstrated during the polar vortexes last winter. We do have some major challenges. First, it's important to understand that we have a highly constrained transmission system that cannot adequately deliver power from upstate New York into the southeastern part of New York, particularly the lower Hudson Valley and New York City. We have abundant generating resources in western and northern New York, but simply lack the transmission to get it downstate. Second, although we've had a lot of new capacity entry in New York over the past 15 years, between 2012 and 2014, we saw our supply resources above the minimum reserve requirement shrink from 5,000 megawatts to 1,900 megawatts. But this reduction is not a cause for alarm. It's largely the result of the interplay of competitive forces. Effective NISO market and planning mechanisms are already in place to preserve reliability. For example, during the summer of 2013, when we had extreme hot weather for 5 days in a row, we called on our demand response resources all 5 days during that prolonged period of high temperatures. A long-standing transmission constraint and shrinking resource margins caused us to create a new capacity zone in the lower Hudson Valley and New York City. A locational price signal was needed to attract generation and retain existing units to maintain reliability. This new capacity zone has caused a great deal of controversy and litigation, but the alternative, risking reliability, was unacceptable to the New York ISO as the entity entrusted with keeping the lights on in New York. Despite the controversy, the capacity zone is working. 2 major generating facilities, Danskamer and Bowline, are in the process of returning to service based on the strong, proper market signals. So we are successfully retaining units needed for reliability, and as these units go back into service, wholesale prices are expected to go down. Emily Nelson, our Vice President of Market Operations, will describe this in more detail during her presentation. Now, does this mean we don't need transmission in New York? Absolutely not. New York needs investment in both transmission and generation to maintain reliability. We need it for several reasons. First, we have an aging transmission grid that needs to be upgraded. Although we're meeting minimum reliability requirements, new transmission will enhance reliability and provide additional operating flexibility and benefits to consumers. Second, there's a great deal of concern about fuel diversity, and I share this concern. Last winter, we successfully operated the system through the polar vortex events, in large part because we were able to switch to oil when gas supplies got tight. We know, however, we can't depend on natural gas to fuel our power plants 100% of the time during the kind of events we had last winter. The good news is in New York we already have a very diverse fleet of resources, some of the best diversity anywhere in the country. In northern and western New York we have abundant non-gas fired resources including hydro, wind, and nuclear. But we can't deliver that power to the load center. And as you look at the graphs that we have up there on fuel diversity, if you look at New York's fuel mix there, you can see when you look statewide, there's great diversity on the system, but when you look downstate on the next slide at the lower Hudson Valley, Long Island, and New York City, you can see it's dominated by gas. So if we had adequate transmission, we could enjoy the fuel diversity where we need it the most at the load centers. Finally, building new transmission to optimize the use of our resources will help improve air quality and yield environmental benefits for New York. The Governor's Energy Highway Initiatives and the PSC's AC transmission proceeding can help solve the problem of our over-reliance on natural gas. Emily Nelson will talk about this and our successes so far. My view is that New York already has a solid market design, but the NISO is committed to making it better, and with all of your support and input, we can do that. Emily will give you more detail about how our capacity market works, hurdles we're working to overcome, capacity and energy market initiatives we're working on, and how we're preparing for the extreme weather like we saw last winter. Then Dr. Patton, the NISO's independent market monitor, will provide his assessment on how New York capacity markets are working and things we can do to improve it. Thank you. Emily?
Thank you. I will explore 4 of the key points raised by Steve in more detail. These include the core reliability purpose of the capacity market, the importance of locational signals, that the markets provide an opportunity for many resource types to compete, and then the initiatives we are pursuing to position New York for the future. First, let us consider that despite the narrowing margins mentioned by Steve, the capacity market has helped to maintain reliability in New York. The primary purpose of the capacity market, from a reliability perspective, is to make sure there are sufficient reserves to meet the load when electricity demand is greatest, on the hottest days of the summer and the coldest days of the winter. The capacity market has been largely responsible for maintaining reserves for resource adequacy for nearly 15 years, including meeting the all-time summer peak load in July of 2013, followed by the all-time winter peak in January of 2014. The market is structured around the concept of having an installed reserve margin to provide reserves above the forecasted peak load. This allows for some degree of resource unavailability, transmission outages, and higher actual loads. The required margin is established annually by the New York State Reliability Council and used to determine the minimum installed capacity requirement. It is designed to help meet the Northeast Power Coordinating Council's requirement that the loss of load expectation cannot exceed 1 day in 10 years. In 2002, the New York PSC proposed a sloped demand curve to recognize the marginal reliability value of incremental capacity resources beyond the minimum needed. The sloped demand curve construct is still in use today and has become a model for other markets. By recognizing capacity above the minimum requirement, the demand curves provide a more predictable revenue stream to generators and help reliability. On this graph, you can see the average annual load in gold, which is on average 19,000 megawatts, and the actual peak load in dark green is almost twice that value. The required resources are shown in light green, and the total available resources in blue, representing the margin available above requirements. It is by design that the capacity market has resulted in the procurement of sufficient resources to meet the resource adequacy needs. Next, let us consider how the markets incent investments in the locations where they are needed. Together, the energy and capacity markets should send economic signals that maintain reliability. They should also provide competitive resources and opportunity to recover both their variable and fixed costs. Although the focus of today's conference is the capacity market, it is worthwhile to spend a moment on the energy and ancillary services markets that we've established in New York. We all work hard to have the energy markets provide effective signals. Some of the features of our market include the simultaneous co-optimization of energy, operating reserves, and regulation. We include energy scarcity pricing and reserve shortage pricing rules. And what this means is that we are establishing schedules on a 5-minute basis for all of these resources, taking into account all of these factors. We establish individual prices for each generator location and for each of the NYSO's 11 specific load zones. Generator schedules, prices, and settlements are determined on a 5-minute basis, providing strong incentives for resources to meet the real-time system needs in New York's highly constrained transmission system. To illustrate the point that energy and capacity markets work in tandem, this slide shows that for a gas turbine in New York City, the estimated energy-related revenues are roughly 30% of total revenues. The percentage of revenues recovered through the energy market and the capacity market does vary by location and technology type and can also change through time with market design modifications. Similar to the energy market, the capacity market should send locational signals to incent investment where it is needed the most. In the capacity market, zones are used to recognize the impacts of transmission bottlenecks or on resource adequacy. The zones also help value resources consistent with the locational needs of the system. This concept is not new. The Long Island and New York City zones date back to the launch of the capacity markets in 2000 and reflect major transmission constraints that continue today. Demand curves are set for each capacity zone and for the New York control area as a whole. The curves are established based on the lowest cost unit needed for reliability or proxy unit that would enter the market to meet demand. The demand curves allow the proxy unit to recover its costs, but do not guarantee that all resources will be made whole. Under this topic of the importance of locational signals, I would like to address the formation of the Lower Hudson Valley Capacity Zone. As shown here for 2013, the reduction in the number of resources in the Lower Hudson Valley resulted in no capacity margin for the area. This is a concern given the transmission constraints into the region, and a much different situation than the margins available more broadly upstate. As system conditions change, resources respond to market signals. They will be incented to stay or enter if prices are high, and to exit if prices are low and they are not needed. In 2014, in order to address a long-standing transmission constraint that limits power flows into southeastern New York, and faced with shrinking resource margins in that area, we established a new capacity zone, encompassing the lower Hudson Valley region and New York City. We understand that the creation of the new zone has led to wholesale capacity price increases, and that have had retail price impacts as well. But the creation of the new zone was necessary, fully consistent with tariff requirements, and will benefit all New York consumers over time. Investment in the lower Hudson Valley is now being made that will bolster long-term reliability and lower capacity prices in the region and the state as new resources enter service. As you can see here in the second bar to the right, a significant portion of the proposed generation in the state is in the lower Hudson Valley. Publicly announced investments underway at this time include the return to service of the Dan Scammer Generating Station and the potential restoration of Bowline Unit 2 to its full capacity. We estimate for the 2015-2016 capability year, total capacity costs in New York will be approximately $400 million lower due to the increases in supply driven by the creation of the new zone. And the total cost in zones G through I will also decrease below what they otherwise would have been. This can be seen in this graph as the relative difference between the two bars. Moving to point 3, the New York capacity market is open to a variety of resources: conventional generation, renewable resources, imports from other regions, and demand response are all able to participate in the capacity market. We work with our stakeholders to accommodate the participation of innovative technologies. Markets evolve with changes in economics, technology, and policy. Open markets provide an avenue for competitive resources to be compensated for the value that they provide. They accommodate public policy by providing a means for resources to compete to satisfy the goal of a reliable system. Along these lines, we look forward to working with the PSC and stakeholders on the REV proceeding initiatives. As Steve communicated, New York has a diverse mix of generation resources. The contribution of the different resource types that met the 2013 electric demand is shown here. As you can see, renewables, including hydro, solar, and wind, provided 23% of the 2013 generation mix. The real-time performance of each resource impacts how much it can offer into the capacity market and how much revenue it has an opportunity to make. Performers that are reliably available make more, and poor performers less. We estimate that the overall availability performance of traditional generation types in New York is roughly 10% better than it was prior to restructuring and the launch of competitive markets. Consistent with public policy objectives, we have helped to achieve beneficial environmental gains by incorporating new technologies such as wind and solar resources into our markets and operations. The market rules accommodate participation by these technologies while recognizing their specific operating characteristics. The amount of wind in the state has grown substantially over the past decade, increasing from roughly 50 megawatts up to 1,700 megawatts on the system today. As an example of the innovation that occurs at the NYSO, in conjunction with our stakeholders, we in short order integrated a centralized wind forecast in our energy markets, determined a means for wind resources to be included in the real-time dispatch, established capacity payments for wind based on their performance on peak days, and upgraded the control center in 2013 to improve operator situational awareness over the long term. All of these things demonstrate our technical leadership. We have also put forth an exemption from buyer-side capacity market power mitigation for renewable energy resources. We also supported a repowering exemption that could facilitate older existing plants making upgrades, for example, to be more environmentally friendly. These proposed rules would eliminate a potential impediment to entry of projects that are unlikely to be used for artificial price suppression. Another example of the intersection of the NYSO's markets and public policy is with respect to emissions. New York participates in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. This is a multi-state policy initiative that seeks to reduce emissions from the power sector. Our energy markets allow generators to reflect the cost of emissions in their energy offers. Charges for carbon dioxide output as part of RGGI have reduced emissions in the Northeast by making large emitters more expensive to operate. We also recognize the need for environmental control technology and the cost of the proxy unit used to establish the demand curves. Much of the investment in New York since the start of the NYSO has been in clean, efficient combined cycle units. 6,000 megawatts of older and generally higher emitting generation has retired or ceased operation since the start of the capacity market. We were also asked to address, as part of this conference, winter preparedness. I'd like to describe this in two parts: the work we've already done and what we need to consider for the future. Last winter, New York had many of the market features and operational requirements in place that served us well. The markets include the ability to provide unique hourly offers into real time and increase them based on expected fuel prices. We also have an early morning day-ahead market posting that allows day-ahead market committed suppliers time to secure gas that they need based off of their schedules. There are also dual fuel requirements driven in large part by the minimum oil burn criteria established by the New York State Reliability Council for New York City and Long Island. This prevents gas shortages from jeopardizing electric reliability. Roughly 46% of our resources have dual fuel capability. Other ISOs and RTOs are pursuing changes to implement similar features that have long been part of doing business in New York. For this winter, the NYSO has taken additional steps to improve operations. We're interested in continually improving. Adding an experienced gas system operator in the control center to monitor conditions on gas pipelines and provide overall gas-electric coordination. Improve the ability to update fuel costs used in generator day-ahead reference levels. That was implemented in June of this year. We've improved fuel inventory monitoring and collaboration with our generators. But now, let's consider what is needed over the longer term, as represented in the third column of this graph. Looking toward the future, the proposed generation in New York is predominantly relying on natural gas, as represented in the green and pink bars in this graph. Even though a large portion of this generation is required to have dual fuel capability, we certainly see that the overall reliance on gas is going to continue to grow. This is echoed on a national scale. The increased use of natural gas is occurring across the country. Although the NYSO's current market designs already incent performance, consideration of fuel assurance is increasingly important given the widespread expectation that New York and other regions will be more dependent on natural gas going forward. It is important that we build upon the current market design to make sure the right incentives are in place to incent operational flexibility and resource performance on the days when it's needed most. During peak days, there is a high demand and competition across the region for power, coupled with fuel supply uncertainty. We need to make sure that resources are available to New York during these stress conditions. A number of interrelated energy and capacity market initiatives are under consideration. On the energy and ancillary services side, we are building on the existing shortage and scarcity pricing rules to reward resources that perform in real time and decrease revenues to poorer performers. As part of the comprehensive shortage pricing, we are considering enhancing the use of regulation and reserve demand curves, carrying more reserves on a statewide basis, and establishing a unique Southeast New York reserve requirement. We are targeting implementation for summer 2015 for these changes. The comprehensive scarcity pricing project, which is currently scheduled for 2016, would further ensure that the energy market reflects the value of demand reductions in the market. On the capacity market side, given that generators receive a significant portion of their revenues from the market and that the current performance measurement is over a longer-term basis, we are considering rule changes to provide additional incentives to maximize resource availability during tight operational periods. These targeted incentives would apply to a limited number of critical operating days and would complement the existing performance evaluation and compensation rules in place today. We intend to move forward with these initiatives, which are currently proceeding through the stakeholder process in a timely and measured manner. With respect to the other initiatives we are pursuing, we currently administer 6-month capability period auctions along with a monthly spot auction. The spot market provides an efficient signal against which resources can make longer-term forward arrangements outside of the capacity auction itself. Market participants can and do execute longer-term bilateral capacity contracts. Overall, the capacity market construct leaves risk with suppliers and investors rather than with consumers. We are taking a fresh look at the question of forward capacity markets. A forward auction may facilitate investments and result in earlier notice of retirements. On the other hand, a forward auction may result in overprocurement or diminish the ability to quickly respond to changing market conditions. We will not make any decisions on this subject until the ongoing evaluation of the forward capacity market construct is complete. We are also considering changes to decrease the frequency of the demand curve reset process, which currently occurs every 3 years. Having appropriate energy and capacity market power mitigation measures that avoid both over and under mitigation is important to a well-designed competitive market. We have proposed new exemptions from buyer-side mitigation that we believe are justified, but to date, there hasn't been sufficient stakeholder support under a shared governance model. In addition to the exemptions already mentioned, we believe that it would be an improvement to establish a competitive entry exemption available to projects that are receiving no subsidies. A competitive entry exemption would allow a merchant project to enter without an offer floor based on its own assessment of future market conditions. We continue to be open to working with stakeholders to try to implement these incremental improvements. We would also like to see enhanced planning processes to identify local issues earlier. This would allow for timely construction of transmission fixes and mitigate the need for out-of-market contracts with units that may be uneconomic. We are open to exploring opportunities in this area. As we consider these changes, there is value in maintaining a consistent market design to minimize regulatory uncertainty and investment risk. However, modifications are necessary over time to address system reliability and market efficiency and to avoid the creation of new seams with neighboring control areas. We think we've balanced these objectives well through time. In closing, the NYISO-administered capacity market is working well overall. It has helped to preserve reliability while sending economic signals that stimulate investments where needed. It has successfully accommodated different classes of resources and given them incentives to perform well. But we understand that it will always be possible to do better, and we look forward to working collaboratively with FERC, the New York PSC, and all stakeholders concerning New York's public policy objectives and possible enhancements to strengthen reliability, improve economic signals, and ultimately better serve consumers. Thank you.
Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning. I think this is a great idea, this conference, to really get together and talk about some of these key issues. I'm going to be moving relatively quickly through a number of topics, including why we have capacity markets, and I think Steve and Emily have done a really good job of talking about some of the aspects of the New York market, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But as far as our background, we've been evaluating the performance of capacity markets in New York, New England, Midwest, and we monitor the markets in Texas as well. And we have the luxury of monitoring 4 markets that are doing 4 entirely different things to try to address resource adequacy. To foreshadow some of the comments that you'll hear later, I think it's our conclusion that New York is by far the best structured and performing market of the 4 that we monitor. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But quickly, why we have capacity markets, in terms of wholesale market signals, there's only 3 sources of revenues that will motivate market participants to make long-term decisions, and those decisions include investment decisions, which we often focus on, but equally important is making good decisions on when to retire units and how much money to spend on maintenance and capital investments to extend the life of units. So all those things are important to think about when you evaluate how well the markets are performing to facilitate those decisions. And the three sources of revenues are the energy and ancillary service markets during non-shortage periods, the revenues during shortage periods, and then the capacity market revenues. It is the case that markets can function without a capacity market, and we refer to that as an energy-only market. But what will happen is you'll probably get somewhere in the range of 8 to 10% capacity margins, and we require 15 to 17%. So you won't get to what you need, and you have a couple of options then. One is to greatly exaggerate your shortage pricing, and New England and Texas are going in that direction. And the second is to have a capacity market that represents your planning requirements to develop market-based signals that augment the energy and ancillary service markets to facilitate the decisions that you need to get you to the planning requirement in the 15 to 17% range. Next slide talks about why we have missing money. I think we all sort of realize, and I've explained, it's really the higher reliability requirements than you will get in an energy-only market that generate the missing money. I'm going to skip ahead to how do you evaluate a capacity market? How do you know whether it's operating well? And I've proposed that there are 4 things you should think about in that regard. One is, are you getting the investment when you need it and where you need it? Secondly, the flip side of that is do you see capacity retiring in an efficient manner? Third is market power being exercised? And then fourth deals with the transparency of the signal and whether that signal is something that investors can forecast and use to make good decisions. It's important to recognize that you don't need the capacity market to do everything that an investor might want or a market participant might want. The capacity market functions as one component in a broader wholesale electricity markets that includes bilateral markets that are entirely outside the RTO construct, but also the energy and ancillary service markets. So based on these criteria, and I think Emily and Steve did a really good job of going over this, I think the New York markets, we've concluded, have functioned really well. We've gotten a lot of investment. We've gotten it when and where we've needed it. The outcomes have been consistently competitive. We found very little capacity being withheld from the market. And retirement decisions have generally been efficient. The one exception to that is the delay in defining the Southeast New York capacity zone did lead to some inefficient retirements and hindered investments, and ultimately raised costs in other areas in Southeast New York because it compelled the NYSO to have to make excess capacity procurements in New York City, where it's very expensive to satisfy the Southeast New York needs. Now, why has New York performed well? And this is a list of the key components of the capacity market. One thing I often say is there is one consistent characteristic that differentiates functional capacity markets in this country from those that are not functioning, and that is the slope demand curve. So let that sink in. New York was just as dysfunctional as the Midwest is now prior to implementing the slope demand curve, as was New England. A second and equally important aspect of the New York market, in part because New York is one of the most transmission-constrained areas in the country, is to have good locational signals. New York has 10 to 20 times the amount of congestion that New England has, even though it's only about 50% larger. That's because the network in New York is highly constrained, and it leads to planning needs that are highly local in nature. And there's no way the capacity market can adequately do its job in facilitating good decisions without having a really good locational set of requirements embedded in it. Thirdly is good market power mitigation measures. Now, although it's performing relatively well, there are two areas where we've recommended a number of improvements. The first is with regard to the mitigation measures. Most of the improvements that I've listed on this slide are improvements that would help ensure that the mitigation measures are effective, but that they don't hinder investment in economic resources. And so we have identified a number of improvements to the buyer side mitigation to help ensure that that's not the case. And then one key change on the supply side to ensure that supply side market power mitigation can't be circumvented. The second set of and probably more important set of improvements that I think would be result in important changes in the New York capacity market is to make the locational framework more dynamic. The reality is that locational needs can arise relatively quickly and disappear relatively quickly as resources retire, as resources are built, or the topology of the system changes, and it's highly beneficial for the capacity market prices to immediately reflect those changes in needs. And that's difficult to accomplish under today's framework. So one thing that would do, having a more dynamic locational framework, is it would mitigate price volatility, because when participants see that something's coming, like a big retirement that's going to create a locational need, they'll start taking actions in response to that even before the price appears. And therefore, you don't get the lag in response with the high price, significant price changes that we see in today's market. It also reduces the need for reliability agreements. And then now I'm just going to address a few of the questions that were posed for this technical conference. The first is, do the NYISO capacity markets need to provide a longer revenue certainty? Our view is that this is not necessary, because a transparent spot capacity signal will facilitate bilateral contracting that can provide that revenue certainty. If the NYISO were to move in the direction of a voluntarily facilitating bilateral contracting, that could potentially be beneficial, but it's not necessary for the base capacity market to do that. Secondly, and I'm asked this a lot, is the New York capacity market, how does it compare with the forward market designs to the north and south of New York? I would say that there's strong evidence that the New York capacity markets are performing well. The theory of the forward capacity markets is that if you move them 3 years out, new resources can participate in the auction. The reality is that investments in resources, that's a 30 to 40 year decision. So deciding based on an auction that's going to provide you a 1 year set of revenue 3 years in advance is not likely to really drive investment efficiently. In reality, investors are probably going to make decisions much in the same way that they make decisions under the New York spot market, which is based on their expectation of revenues over the long term. But it does, by locking in an obligation 3 years in advance, it does raise risk for both the investor who took that obligation and may not be able to make it in 3 years, as well as the existing resource that has to keep their unit in operation for the next 3 years. And there can be significant uncertainty around that. And so for that reason, it might even be less effective than the New York spot market. And that brings us to the lock-in provision, which is designed to overcome much of what I just said about the 1 year capacity revenue. A lock-in provision that locks in multiple years of revenues, we're concerned, can significantly increase the costs over the long term. So I think, although the forward markets have been moving in that direction, I think it's worthwhile to be very careful and evaluate how that performs before concluding that that's something that's going to benefit consumers over the long term. And the NYISO is engaging in an independent study of these issues. We look forward to reviewing those results. The next question surrounded whether long-term bilateral contracts are a feasible alternative to the procurement model in New York. I'd say that I think bilateral contracts are a complement to the New York capacity market. I don't think they're a reasonable substitute because they don't provide transparent price signals and can't facilitate efficient decisions by suppliers. A contract mechanism, as a bilateral contract mechanism as opposed to the multilateral coordination of the NYSO market would create pay-as-bid incentives and would create a variety of challenges, not the least of which is how you address market power in transmission-constrained areas. And long-term bilateral contracts, as a substitute for the capacity market, would tend to shift risk from investors and suppliers onto the customers that are required to hold those contracts. And then there's a couple of questions on whether there are changes in the capacity market needed to motivate better resource performance and fuel assurance. In both of those areas, I think it's very important to recognize that our short-term energy and ancillary service shortage pricing should be the primary incentive that suppliers have to perform well and to have alternative fuel sources, because when we enter into shortages because of either gas system contingencies or poor resource performance, the resources that are performing or have alternative fuel or have arrangements to procure gas when gas is scarce make a lot of money. So there's a large carrot there, but when they can't perform, it's also a substantial stick. And so getting the shortage pricing right, I think, has to always be your first objective. And then the NYSO is also considering whether there's complementary changes in some of the aspects of the capacity market too that would augment that. And I talked about fuel firmness. So to wrap up, the New York capacity markets are functioning well. I think we've proposed a number of incremental changes in the area of the locational framework as well as the mitigation measures. But the last thought I want to leave you with is stability in the design of the market is extremely important, because we're asking market participants to make very long-term commitments and investments. So it's important not to raise the risk associated with those investments and to focus as much as possible on maintaining a stable market design that evolves over time. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I thought that was an excellent setup presentation of where the markets are now, and I appreciated Dr. Patton's thoughts on some of the various market design issues we're looking at. I want to start with a question that points a little bit toward the future, because if there's one thing I know, it's that children in their 20s can still have lots of issues. Not just when they're teenagers. And I know in the New York ISO capacity needs assessment, there's a significant capacity need in 2019, 5 years out. And I wonder, I'm interested in whether you are confident that with the current market design, you can meet that need through the market, or will you think we'll need a lot of out-of-market resources that'll need exemptions and so forth to do that?
Well, let me just first say that I'm confident that it can be met because of the activity we've had in the interconnection queue with new units in the lower Hudson Valley that have gone through the interconnections process, the 3 phases of the interconnection studies, gone through the buyer side mitigation analysis and so forth. And so they are units prepared to go and break ground once that need gets more real. And we think the big driver on making investment and putting a shovel in the ground is driven mainly by supply and demand. When they see that supply and demand is getting closer, and they know we have a slope demand curve that's going to mean that prices will go higher, they make investments. If we're in a surplus situation, obviously they don't. So as we see that need getting closer, and then there's also the uncertainty of Indian Point in New York. What's going to happen with Indian Point? I think there's a whole host of processes working to try to protect the reliability for that, and then there's investment waiting to jump in, including a line from Canada that you've all read about, and other more localized generating resources. And then we have the REV proceeding that's going to unleash the behind-the-meter resources, which also will bear additional much value, I think, to New York. And we're very excited to work with the chair of the PSC and the PSC team on that.
I think David already answered this, thank you, but you're not worried that if a dynamic market sets a high price for a while, money floods in, and then that price corrects down, and there's no kind of forward period of lock-in, that, I mean, I can ask the investors this at a future panel, but you're confident you'll get what you need?
Well, we're exploring the idea of a forward capacity market. We have an independent assessment being made of it. We've had two before, and why are we doing that? The past year or so, I've been getting more favorable reports from Terry Boston and Gordon Van Daly about the way the PJM and New England forward markets are beginning to get investment. Terry's especially excited about what has cleared in PJM, and so that's making us take pause and look at this and make sure we're understanding the value of a forward capacity market and the pros and the cons. And so we're in the midst of that analysis right now, and we'll have some conclusion to that by second quarter of next year.
Yeah, can I add a comment on there? So we monitor the planning process, and it's relatively frequent that we see these reliability needs coming up in different areas. It's never been the case that New York's had to rely on backstop solutions to come in and fill the gap because the market didn't perform. I think to your point of the boom and bust cycle, one thing that's valuable about the New York market structure is the demand curve creates a performance in the capacity market that can be forecasted by investors. So if I'm an investor and I can see what other people are doing, which I can because the investment process is relatively transparent in New York, then I can forecast where prices are going with the response other people are making and my own response, and make good decisions on whether to enter or not enter, which I think overcomes the kind of problem that you're thinking about.
So you think the RMRs are just local things here and there and not a sign of...
Yeah, RMRs always exist when you have local needs that aren't reflected in your capacity markets. And so in New England, before they had local requirements, they had something like 40% of their capacity under RMRs. Yeah. In New York's never had to rely on RMRs extensively. A very, very small number of them, and they're for extremely local requirements right now that you really couldn't design a capacity market requirement around.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you to all the panelists. I think this is very helpful, and I have just a few questions as we're sort of moving on, and maybe. So one is, in terms of picking up, David, on your last point. So when you're talking about a dynamic pricing market, you're thinking about a larger area than a single unit could solve, like a short-term R&R. We call it RSS. So
yeah,
I can stick with my acronym.
It's easier.
Yeah, that's okay. To solve a potentially just limited transmission constraint. Is that?
Yes.
So a dynamic market would be more like a load zone that could get created where it could be either solved by multiple generation or multiple solutions.
Yes.
And then, okay. So with that, I just want to pick up on this issue. One of the things that in terms of the capacity market is we're talking about it, it's just to actually incent entry into the market, but to be absolutely technology neutral relative to the resource itself. And that would apply to transmission as well, right? Because I'm thinking about in terms of the new capacity zone, it was a transmission constraint, not necessarily an adequacy issue, and it could have been solved with transmission as well as with generation.
We do take into account different resource types as far as establishing the proxy unit, which is then setting the demand curves. So we revisit the demand curves every 3 years. We are by tariff required to use basically the most cost-effective resource to solve the demand that we're projecting. But from the perspective of being a technology agnostic, other than making sure it's the most efficient resource, we do allow all different resource types to come in and participate in our markets. We think it is important that the value that they receive from the market is consistent with what they provide from a reliability perspective.
Sure. I guess my question was more not necessarily setting the unit itself, but when we think about capacity zones moving forward and the need to create a new capacity zone, the ability to site and build transmission and reduce congestion can be just as important a vehicle to eliminate the need for a new zone than building localized generation.
Yeah, in fact, part of our recommendation on the dynamic framework is to establish effectively capacity transfer rights that would motivate investors to build transmission because they'd get the value of satisfying the local need through transmission, and so that we're not only incenting generation.
Right, and so from your perspective, if in fact we get transmission built to eliminate a constraint, then you wouldn't want a localized capacity zone because that would be sending a bad signal if there was if it wasn't a constrained market.
Yeah, so in the kind of dynamic framework that we're talking about, the constraint would just stop binding and prices would equalize, and you know, whether a zone exists or doesn't exist becomes sort of academic because the prices would be the same.
The other thing I just wanted to touch on was, is this whole issue of moving forward with both capacity and bilateral contracts. Because one of the things that I think is important for us, and as I think about this, maybe the different objectives, not even objectives, but the different obligations on the FERC and the State Commission. For us, I would say for the Commission, and I know this is, or the FERC, you're really focused on reliability, and you don't get into issues in terms of fuel type relative to do we prefer one fuel type or another. It's fairly neutral. The state, on the other hand, has an intense interest from a policy perspective of maintaining fuel diversity and meeting our clean energy goals, as well as making sure we're looking at things to do maintain fuel reliability, et cetera. Thinking about gas pipeline and use of land and all those various things. So David, from what I'm hearing from you is that you think that a well-designed capacity market that essentially enables bilaterals of some type because it sends the right price signal may be the ideal situation rather than just looking at a forward price curve and allowing the market to respond. But I would think that in that construct, so long as the bilateral was not intended to reduce prices, but actually to secure either a public policy goal or what other goal, that you would think that it would be important then not to mitigate those contracts, because otherwise you would disincent people from entering into them.
Yeah, I think one thing we always have to recognize is that the markets exist to address reliability. So, and there are an awful lot of other benefits outside the realm of reliability that aren't priced in our markets, and so and that's what a lot of public policy is really designed to get at, environmental benefits and other things. So there's no reason why the markets there should be any conflict between efforts to secure those benefits and the markets.
So then I would hope that going forward to the ISO's point, we could work together because, and I think this is where the rub is sometimes, is where the state is trying to effectuate certain local policy issues such as clean energy, maybe looking at local reliability issues, things like that, that we would want to make sure that the markets are complementing these objectives. And seems to me we can do that in a non-disruptive way.
I definitely think that's right. I think if the objectives are reliability, like local reliability, I think the best way to do that is try to embed that in the market design. But for all the other objectives, I think you're right.
Thank you.
I wasn't going to ask another question, but now I just want to push a little. Even if a out-of-market contract that specifies a certain fuel, which might be for extremely worthy purposes, is not designed to reduce prices, doesn't it still reduce prices if you just pull it out of the market? I mean, because when you look at things like RGGI, they price the environmental attributes kind of right into the market. But if you have exempt out-of-market contracts, they might have nothing, the desire might have nothing to do with price formation, but don't they still affect price formation?
They do. But you have to ask yourself, if we were pricing all of these things, what would the market do? The market would naturally select a different resource than we would select in our market. So if the bilateral contract is basically leading you towards the outcome that you would get if you were pricing some of these unpriced benefits, then although it impacts the market, it's not a distortion.
So you're saying that if you could perfectly price the environmental externalities in the market, they'd be priced in, we'll assume for a minute that RGGI's pricing, at least to the extent they put the price on carbon, in the market, but the bilateral contracts, if you get it right, are a surrogate that somehow...
Yeah. So what you always have to be careful of is not to have bilateral contracts that are premised on providing compensation for attributes that are already fully priced in the market, because that's just a distortion. Yeah.
I'm going to pass the mic along.
I want to pick up something you said, Audrey, about transmission. One of the more effective presentations I've seen in New York was probably 7 years ago when I was shown the dynamics of the transmission constraints going into the lower Hudson Valley. The thunderstorms come in, knock them out. You have LMPs that go through the roof. The point is, you need more transmission in this market, something I've been working on to some degree of effectiveness over the years. And as Commissioner Brown will know, I'm pro-transmission, and I think I commend your governor for recognizing it. But here it is 7 years later, and there's still arguably a lack of transmission. My point being, yes, it's a good solution, but it's getting harder and harder to put wires up and pipes in the ground. So hence part of the motivation for me backing the new zone. I wish you well, but it's going to be very hard.
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment, just to make sure you're updated, there is going to be new transmission in service in New York this summer. And it's going to give us significant additional reliability value, called the TOTS projects. And then the AC transmission proceeding is going through the PSC, and the NISO is very involved in running analysis for the PSC and all those activities. And so I think it does take time to get transmission built, but I'm very encouraged by what's happening now.
Yeah, and Phil, I appreciate your comments, but as you know, we're hard at work on this to get this done. So, yeah. But just if I could pick up, because I think this is an important part for us going forward. We have had, if I understand, about 6,000 megawatts of new build, 5,000 megawatts in new build and additions in New York since the market started.
I think the total is 10,000. We had that many retirements, and we had about 10,000.
10,000 new build.
Yeah.
But from what I understand, is only about a third of those are truly merchant. The rest are through some form of bilateral agreements. Is that correct?
I'd say all of the resources end up in bilateral contracts. Every resource does, because they want a portfolio of sales to just like you do in your stock portfolio. And so in our market is open and encourages bilaterals.
And I think that was my point, not necessarily that prices would stay the same, but that you can do bilaterals, and they are a way to actually further incent investment, and if mitigated, they could actually disincent investment, and so we need to be careful about what we're trying to incent and disincent.
I think that's a fair comment. I think it's a matter of if the market is short, then it makes sense to have that investment, be it through contracts or through merchant build. And if the market is long, then those signals aren't there, and that's when I think we encounter some of the contentious mitigation issues that we face.
I just have one more fact question. So my understanding is that since 2011, the capacity bills that went through ISO. It went from about $1 billion to about $3 billion from this last summer. That's right?
That's approximately correct. They increased substantially from 2012 compared to the most recent years.
And what can we do?
Well,
I mean, is that going to be a continuing phenomenon, or are there things we could be doing, or what's, if you could sort of elaborate what's causing that?
What's causing it is supply and demand. I mean, when prices were 50 cents in the rest of the state for capacity, these units couldn't pay their taxes. So they started retiring. And so when they start retiring and you have a sloped demand curve, prices are going to go up. And they stop retiring and start rebuilding and getting new investments. So that's just the way it works. When prices are low, and with 50 cents, that's low, and units couldn't survive. And so the 50-cent number was probably where the $1 billion came from. It seems like a big number, $1 billion, but when it's spread over that many units and that many megawatts, it's not. It really affected their financial viability. And now that prices are in a higher range, but when you look at other ISOs around us, they're in a very reasonable range. And if you look at the cost of a proxy unit, what it takes to build a new unit to keep the lights on, it's all based on that. And so when supply is high, prices are going to be low, and people will retire, and more inefficient units will retire. So it's actually the system is working.
But there again, I would think that if part of the problem we have is in western New York is low capacity prices, higher price zones downstate. The ability to eliminate the constraints in the market can be as good an influence in terms of helping moderate prices and retain these units that are needed for tax and other purposes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one nice thing about good locational signals, both in capacity and energy, is that it really allows you to determine where transmission is most valuable and helps in the planning process.
Thank you. Now I am done.
Okay.
We're open for
I
others.
know Commissioner Clark has a question. I don't want to...
I just have one, and it's a follow-up on something that Audrey asked, because I think she put her finger right on where, I think you mentioned where the rub is, and I think it really is the core issue, and it's one that I've struggled with for a time, and I just want to make sure I understand, Dr. Patton, where you're going with this, because I've contended for some time. I can understand how investments get made and capital formations happen and decisions are made about generation resource planning in still vertically integrated states, whether they're outside of the markets or whether they're in an operating energy market. And I can understand where states that have just totally restructured or unbundled and said, we're going to let the market decide where everything gets placed, and just that's that, which is probably ERCOT's closest to that. But the challenge and the rub seems to be in these areas like New York and other places in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, where there's still I'll call it almost a quasi-integrated resource planning that happens at the state. I don't know that states would individually call it that, but it's an attempt to shape the generation resource profile.
We call it that. We're kind of old school.
So explain to me how that fits together and works, because that is where I hear a lot of concern from stakeholders, is we end up potentially, if it doesn't work well, in a situation where you get the worst of all worlds. You have kind of a market operating that's supposed to drive where investment gets made, but at the same time, one where price pressure could be very easy to happen, and so you don't get quite the market outcomes that you otherwise would. But I'm hearing today that you think there's a way to structure those bilaterals in a way that takes care of that concern that I think Cheryl started to scratch the surface on.
Yeah, that is actually one of the most difficult problems to try to address in these markets, and I think from a planning perspective, the objective should always be to bring as much consistency between the planning requirements and the market requirements as you can, so that the markets drive the satisfaction of those requirements. I think what I was suggesting is that almost all of the planning requirements that in all of these markets that we are addressing are the reliability requirements. So if you hear that there's state action for reliability purposes, that's a red flag. But you can't discount that there are other benefits provided by that aren't captured in our markets. And so to the extent that the action is being taken to capture some of those other benefits, it's, to most economists, that's not irrational as long as the actions that are taken are commensurate with the benefits that they're capturing. So you're right that it's extremely difficult, and it's one of the reasons why the structuring mitigation measures that don't serve as an uneconomic barrier to entry is so difficult, and why we're taxing FERC with so many incremental changes to those measures to try to make sure that they function properly and strike the right balance in trying to solve that problem.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions, colleagues?
I'd like to follow up on a concept that you introduced, Dr. Patton, about transfer of capacity pricing maybe to a transmission owner who is putting in a project that acts really the same as adding new generation for a constrained location. That sounds like maybe an entirely new way of pricing transmission. And could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so we under nodal markets, one of the things we do is we establish financial transmission rights that are the economic property right associated with the congestion between locations. And so if somebody builds transmission that increases capability, let's say in New York City, then they can receive those sorts of congestion rights to compensate them for the value that they provided to the system. So that's on the energy side, and that's sort of well understood. But I think one thing that we're seeing in these markets is that when you move outside of the operating horizon and congestion, there's substantial value to transmission from a planning perspective to solve things like transmission security issues, which is one of the big issues that necessitated the creation of the Lower Hudson Valley Zone. And if somebody building transmission, let's say 2/3 of the benefit of the transmission is that we can procure less in Southeast New York, or we can procure less capacity in New York City, that value could very well be greater than the congestion value that we're giving them in the form of a financial transmission right. So if we want to motivate potentially private investment in transmission, or even provide some offset to the regulatory compensation for transmission investment, then defining that sort of right and granting it to folks building transmission, would be an important way to do that.
I just wanted to comment that the new FERC Order 1000 now opens up the door for us to quantify those kind of benefits in the savings associated with transmission projects that will be rolling through the new processes working in New York.
Well, I want to thank our panelists, but they're going to be sitting right in the front row so they can participate in the next conversation as well as appropriate. But I guess we'll call up the next panel. We're not going to take a formal break, is my understanding, but people can go in and out as needed, and we may also. But thank you.
Just one observation. If you've spent a lot of time on New England and New York, I think Steve is the common denominator.
Also, ice storms and cold snaps and heat waves seem to follow me.